For those of you joining us on Zoom, welcome. Get comfortable. We'll be starting just probably a minute or two after 3. We still have people coming into the museum here. I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that during the program, you can ask a question at any time by typing it in to the box. If you look at your Zoom screen, either the top or the bottom will say QA, questions and answers. And that's where you can enter your question at any time. We will hold all of the questions until the end of the formal remarks. And then Ruth Gilbert Whitner, who's here at the museum, will be voicing all of your questions. We've never had trouble getting to all of your questions. So get comfortable. We'll be back with you as we're about to start the program. Just a reminder to, first of all, get comfortable, get yourself a glass of water. The formal remarks today should run about 50 minutes, 50 minutes. So get yourself a glass of water, whatever. And look for the QA feature on your Zoom screen at the top or the bottom. And that's where you can enter a question at any time. We will hold all the questions until the end. And then Ruth Gilbert Whitner, my colleague here, is going to voice all of your questions. So feel free as something comes to mind to go ahead and enter that. And otherwise, we'll be joining you in just a couple of minutes to start the program. Okay, we're going to get our program started. Thank you all for coming out on a sunny and not too chilly afternoon. I'm going to begin by turning the program over to Max Nelbish, and I'll be back with you in a second. Max?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for making the trek out here today to join us for the second installment of our lecture series on Suburbia, all about the bulldozer and its impact. I don't know about you, but I love talks like this and books like this because it's a total facet of history that I never really think about. Like, I've never sat down and said, what is the history of the bulldozer? What is its impact? So I'm very excited for today. I hope you are too. I cannot recommend Professor Ammon's book enough. Some of you may remember me from September's lecture series event, but if you don't, my name is Max Nosbish. I'm the new education manager at the Hingham Historical Society, and you'll be seeing a lot more of me as we go forward with Suburbia and with future lecture series throughout the coming years. And I hope to see you all there for those as well. I want to remind everyone of some fantastic events we have coming up at the Hingham Historical Society, all sorts of stuff. We have special cart tours happening the week of Thanksgiving. It's going to be like a marathon of cart tours. We're going to be doing like 6 a day. So Deirdre and I and a couple of our coworkers will be here, and we will, if you get your family out of the house, get them to learn some history. And if you haven't joined us for the cart tours yet, that's a great opportunity to do so. Coming up this Wednesday, we have our Harvest Supper from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. And that is another fantastic book with another fantastic speaker. His name is Professor Stephen Angle. He's coming all the way from Florida, and he'll be talking all about the life of John, Albie, and Andrew, our Civil War governor, the guy right behind me right here. So buy your ticket for that. It's a wonderful dinner. It's going to be a great talk. And again, that's Wednesday from 6 to 9. And another Wednesday on November 29th is we have our holiday tea from 2 to 4 p.m. And I think we're going to be having someone talk about the history of Christmas. And so that'll be a fun event as well. And then last but not least, our next speaker's event is December 3rd, and that's with James O'Connell, and we'll be talking about Greater Boston suburban development, and that's at 3 p.m. And I hope to see you all there for that. And last, I guess now for the real last but not least thing, we have our Hingham History Fund coming up, and we'll need all your support. I always say, whenever I tell anybody about the Hingham Historical Society, I always say we are one historical society with 3 museums, and we are growing. And you've seen us the past couple months in the community here doing all sorts of events, and we need your support coming up for that. So keep your eye out for the Hingham History Fund. And I want to thank Eileen for all the work she's been doing with this lecture series. And I also want to thank Ellen Miller for keeping the Old Ordinary alive and just keeping it up and running and taking that stress off our plate. So I just want to give those two a shout out. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Max. My name is Eileen McIntyre. I serve on the board of the Hingham Historical Society, and it is my pleasure to chair the education committee that makes these lecture series possible. This is the second of 7 programs in our series, Suburbia, the American Dream. In September, we heard from Kenneth Jackson, who discussed demographic, sociological, political, and economic factors that led to the development of American suburbs. He also touched on some specific technological advances that were important as suburbs developed beginning in the 19th century, including a new balloon frame style of building and the machine nail, which transformed home building from a specialized craft into an industry, as well as the electric streetcar and the commuter railroad. Today, we will learn about another technical advance, in this case, an earth-moving machine known as the bulldozer, which facilitated post-World War II changes in both the urban and suburban landscape. Our speaker, who is about to join us on screen, Francesca Ammon, is Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning and Historic Preservation at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. A social and cultural historian, Professor Ammon is the author of Bulldozer, Demolition and Clearance of the Postwar Landscape, winner of the 2017 Lewis Mumford Prize for the Best Book in Planning History. Francesca's scholarship has been published in many academic and professional journals. She's received fellowships and awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Society of Architectural Historians and other organizations. Francesca currently is writing a history of post-war historic preservation and urban renewal focused on the Philadelphia neighborhood of Society Hill. Francesca, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you all. Thank you for having me virtually today. I appreciate the flexibility to do that. And I'm glad the book could physically make it. So it's good to see that. I'm going to share some slides now. I'm going to get small because I want you to see the images associated with the presentation. So please bear with me for just a moment. Okay. That looks right. Okay. So thank you again to the Hingham Historical Society for inviting me here to be a part of what looks like really a fabulous lecture series. And I want to especially thank Eileen McIntyre for reaching out, for all the help with the logistics and all of this and making it possible for me to be here. I'm delighted to be speaking in this lecture series. And as was mentioned, I'll be talking about my book, Bulldozer, which is really the first scholarly history of the bulldozer. You'll find other more books that are more oriented towards enthusiasts of machinery and equipment. But this is the first time that someone's looked at kind of what the machine has meant, both technologically, but socially and culturally too. And its story traverses suburban, urban, and rural terrain. It's really the first excavation, in a way, on my project of the means and meanings of building demolition and land clearance in the post-World War II United States. And in this project, I asked really, how was it that post-war Americans came to equate destruction with progress, which isn't necessarily an obvious conflation. So I'll offer a brief overview of the project's three main parts. I'll get into the slides in just a second. And then I'll dig more deeply into one of the book's main storylines to demonstrate the intertwined influence of the military and of bulldozer businesses, as I call them, in the making of the post-war landscape, and especially of suburban landscapes. So let me begin. So the shape of the American landscape changed dramatically in the decades following World War II. In order to clear space for new suburban tract housing, interstate highways, and urban renewal development, wrecking companies demolished buildings and earth-moving contractors leveled land at an unprecedented pace and scale. These things all happened in the past, but they really ballooned in this period. I've calculated, for example, that during the 1960s alone, which was a peak period for this activity, demolition crews tore down, on average, 1 out of every 17 dwelling units nationwide. That was the average. Some places did it more than others. Many of these losses came from urban renewal, which itself displaced nearly 1 million families and over 100,000 businesses by 1980, when that program basically came to a close. And at the same time, each of the more than 46,000 miles of interstate highways, on average, consume the homes of roughly 20 individuals and roughly 40 acres of land. That's for each mile. In total, then, interstate highway construction removed 42 billion cubic yards of earth. Clearance for the development of suburban housing, shopping, industry just added further acreage to the toll. So while the post-war decades, I think, are typically well known as an era of rapid American growth and construction, in my project, I reconceptualized them as equally significant for large-scale destruction, both the implementation of that and the celebration of that. The post-war period is exceptional within a long history of the creative destruction of the American landscape for the realization of large-scale clearance on a nationwide level. And I argue in the book that a culture, what I call a culture of clearance, that is the ideology, technology, policy, and practice of large-scale destruction made possible this radical remaking of both city and country. And I also argue that this culture of clearance was powerfully rooted in the preceding experience of war. It was no accident that these two things happened one after the others. And in this image that you see before you, you can see International Harvester bulldozers lined up to be sent out to the Pacific Front. And although the proliferation of the bulldozer in scholarly texts beginning in at least the early 1960s could suggest that this literary terrain is well covered, the term in those books more often serves as a symbol of protest than a subject of inquiry. Authors of such as the books I've shown here, they name the machine as the enemy of minority urban residents, elite preservationists, suburban environmentalists, but they haven't typically investigated how the machine worked or why it initially appealed to so many mayors, developers, engineers, and even the general public. Through a variety of sources, ranging from military logbooks to the archives of construction equipment manufacturers, popular and trade journals, redevelopment agency records, the census, oral histories, even as you'll see popular movies and children's books, I place the machine front and center in my story. And then I trace the unraveling of the bulldozer's broad base of support as its destructive process played out on the ground. So in this way, I'm really exploring a subject that's previously remained hidden in plain sight. Think, for example, of classic before and after images that really dominate the visual iconography of the post-war built environment. I'll share just an example pairing for you of a city a bit down the road from you in New Haven, Connecticut. This image pairing appeared in Progressive Architecture magazine in 1968, and it shows aerial views of the Oak Street neighborhood in New Haven before and after urban renewal. On the left, you see a dense mixed-use area of predominantly 3 to 5 story wooden brick structures, including housing, religious institutions, shops, light industry. And on the right are high-end, high-rise housing, office buildings, parking lots, and a highway. And you might think of ground level pairings of this, showing contrasted outdated kitchens, for example, versus the new modern kitchens of the period. So the post-war period really delighted in showing these before and afters because of the degree of change that occurred. So when I say that clearance falls between the cracks of existing discourse, I really mean that quite literally. I'm referring to that literal crack between these images here. And I want to understand what happened in between the before and after, and what did progress or quote unquote progress look like when it was in progress on the ground. All right, I see I'm getting a hand. Is there an issue that I should be aware of? Ruth? No?
Nope, I wouldn't worry about it.
Okay, all right. All right, I'll go back. All right. All right, so in examining the process behind the creation of the built environment, I'm suggesting then that it's not only what we build, but how we build that matters. And so what does the examination of landscape creation through destruction tell us? Well, I narrate the story in 3 parts. 1, bulldozers at work. Secondly, first, bulldozers at war, bulldozers at work, and bulldozers of the mind. And so let me just very briefly outline those 3 sections for you. In part 1, bulldozers at war, I trace the technological, economic, and cultural foundations of modern mass clearance to mid-century theaters of war. The war really laid important groundwork for the domestic built environment that follows. That's often overlooked, in history courses, for example, when we begin the study of post-war cities and suburbs only after the conflict was through. In my own teaching, I know the war is a period that we often skip over. You have the Depression, the New Deal, and all those activities, and then all the energies were diverted to dealing with the war and then cleaning up kind of the mess of the non-maintenance, non-production of housing that happened afterwards. But I want to look more closely at what the war meant for planning and development. Rather than the war being a mere interruption to housing and highway development, it was a critical catalyst to the shape of the post-war American landscape. Viewing it in this way demonstrates how wartime innovations and exceptional practices can spill over into the post-war domestic life. World War II advanced potent technologies, the atomic bomb, air power, chemical weapons, and the bulldozer stands alongside these. Such wartime to peacetime technological transfers is as relevant to World War II and its aftermath as it is in more contemporary conflicts. Think, for example, of drones and the way those kinds of technologies have transferred over. Not the exact machines themselves necessarily, but the concept of them and the technologies as well. So to take this a step further, the flow of construction-related machines, men, methods, even metaphors from the international battlefront to the domestic home front facilitated what we might think of as something of a militarization of the American landscape. And I'll say more about that shortly. In part two, Bulldozers at Work, I examined the often separately treated histories of post-war cities, suburbs, and rural landscapes, showing how similar material and cultural processes really shaped both of them. They end up looking different, but there was an underlying commonality. I used case studies of land clearance in Orange County, California, building demolition in New Haven, Connecticut, and the combination of both of those practices for highway construction across the country. And I show how diverse geographies shared a common quest for the seemingly quote unquote blank slates that were necessary for new large scale development. And business proved critical in realizing these ideals. In their pursuit of post-war profits, equipment manufacturers and operators helped add buildings and land to the list of goods that were devoured by post-war consumption. Further, these parallel pursuits yielded related consequences. In each, celebratory tropes of rapid progress gave way on the ground to damaging processes of spatial destruction and environmental injustice. And these costs were disproportionately distributed along lines of race, class, sex, and gender. I'll say more about all these things, just trying to give you the overview here. In the final section of the book, Bulldozers of the Mind, I show that just as bulldozers transformed the physical landscape, they also permeated cultural imagination. And I'm a social historian, but also a cultural historian, and I think this piece of the argument is critical as well. This slide shows two examples of this process in progress: a children's bulldozer book on the left, and stills from a film of a house wrecking that were made by the artist Gordon Maddock Clark on the right. Diverse popular representations in films, photographs, conceptual art, children's books and toys, both reflected and shaped clearance practice. They provided windows into how the public saw this work, and over time, these forms also gave voice to more critical turns in popular attitudes, as a culture of clearance gave way, at least somewhat, to a culture of conservation. These forms also illustrate the significance not just of plans and architectural drawings, the traditional visual culture of representing the built environment, but also of broader cultural discourse to the shape of the built world. So building on that introduction, I want to elaborate on an integral piece of my argument that cuts across all three of these sections of the work. The ways that what we might call the bulldozer businesses, that is equipment manufacturers, engineers, and construction men, built upon the war to make the post-war American landscape physically, economically, and psychologically possible. This is my one text slide. I just want to give you the roadmap of where I'm headed next. And we can see these connections along at least four key dimensions, which I'll use to structure the rest of the talk. We see advancements in equipment technology that occurred during the war and shaped the post-war landscape. We see training of equipment operators, rehearsal of the applications of large-scale building demolition and earth-moving practices, and finally, the glorification of the bulldozer, its operators, and its practices in a positive all-American light. And all of these factors, as I've said, were powerfully rooted in the preceding experience of war. So that's where I want to really begin. Now, during World War II, thousands of US manufacturers had to stop making what they had been producing and reorient their factories for wartime production. They made tanks, airplanes, shells, and other armaments. Think, for example, of Ford assembly lines that churned out aircraft at Willow Run. But for many construction equipment manufacturers, wartime production demands were largely compatible with existing products. They didn't have to stop making what they were making to support the war. They could continue doing it. Allied forces, for example, deployed more than 100,000 tractors during World War II. They equipped many of those tractors with bulldozer blades, turning them into the machine that we commonly refer to as the bulldozer, even though the term bulldozer itself technically just applies to the blade. I think in common usage, people talk about the machines, and I do that in this talk as well. As you can see in this ad on the screen, this large-scale construction equipment deployment even led one manufacturer, International Harvester, to call the entire conflict, quote, a dirt-moving war. And during World War II, the tractor bulldozer proved so important to the military that the War Production Board ultimately asked Caterpillar, which was its #1 construction equipment supplier, to stop making diesel tank engines. They had started shifting their production processes that way in order to devote more resources to crawler tractor production. Now, Caterpillar self-servingly suggested that this signaled that their machine was more important than the tank. And General Patton made the comparison explicit when he purportedly stated that, quote, "If I had to choose between bulldozers and tanks for an invasion, I'd choose the bulldozers every time." Now, although I focus here on the bulldozer as the iconic example of this process, the military commanded an array of construction equipment, including cranes, shovels, and scrapers, which are these vehicles with large bowls for carrying earth once it had been pushed by a bulldozer. But what's important to note here is that in producing these machines, equipment manufacturers were simultaneously advancing their commercial product lines. So they'd emerged from the war with something that was ready to go in the post-war domestic landscape. But General Patton wasn't the only one singing the bulldozer's praises. One of the most famous urban renewal developers, a man named William Zeckendorf, once called the bulldozer, quote, "the best invention we got out of the war." Now, he wasn't quite right. World War II did not invent the bulldozer. In fact, it didn't even spur the invention of any new major pieces of commercial construction equipment. But what it did was it hastened the advancement of the existing core technologies, and the bulldozer among them. So you see in ads like this one from International Harvester, the touting of these advances. The ad declares that when harvester machines went to war, nothing changed but the paint, right? They were all ready to go. They were already strong and worthy for this effort. But over time, however, the machines they were producing by the heart of the conflict, everything, that is the technology within them, had changed but the paint, right? They had to improve them through the needs of the war. In the pre-war years, there was very little consumer demand for improvement in the relatively slow operating, medium-sized tractors that relied upon favorable weather and favorable terrain for their operation. But World War II was, quote, "the crucible," as one equipment expert has put it, that stimulated the intensity of research activity necessary for improved machines. And as the war came to a close, manufacturers could advertise to their customers, who had been deprived by the War Production Board of years of new equipment, that they'd soon be able to buy products that had been proven on tough battlefield terrain. So for companies like Caterpillar, which was one of the top 100 out of more than 85,000 war contractors, right? Top 100. The war was not a distraction from business as usual, but rather an intensification of everyday life that positioned them very well for the return to peacetime operations. And post-war equipment, construction equipment advanced accordingly. So for example, on pre-war machines, cable-based operations dominated. But during the war and post-war years, hydraulic controls became increasingly common. They provided faster response times, smoother cycling. New metallurgy made post-war machines more durable and stronger. Engines increased in power and speed. Shovels grew in capacity. As Popular Science noted just 5 years after the war's end, the new quote-unquote big mouth machines could eat a ton of earth per second and, quote, literally move a mountain a day. The concurrent development of smaller but powerful, nimble machines offered mechanization in confined and isolated spaces. And all these wartime advances continued over time, such that between 1950 and 1960, that first just a decade following the war, the Caterpillar tractor scraper combination increased its capacity by 30% and its horsepower by 50%. These gains more than balanced out associated growth in price, such that by the 1960s, earth-moving costs were still as low as they had been in 1929. So bulldozing was cheap, and this was key. All right. In addition to advancing equipment, war also trained an army of men to maintain and operate these machines. Caterpillar and International Harvester actually staffed their own battalions to service these machines in the field, keeping both the equipment and the men's own skills in fighting shape. Other soldiers also took up the construction trades for military purposes during the war. They served as Army engineers, which is a longer running group, and as part of the construction battalions, or CBs for short. The Seabees were a brand new division of the Navy during World War II, and they were formed to both build and fight. Originally, the Seabees tapped men who were often a bit older in age. They were the ones who had the expertise to work with this equipment and were trained in construction work. But eventually they tapped out those ranks and needed to start bringing in non-skilled, typically younger soldiers as well, and they would train them such that they could work in the Seabees. In total, more than 325,000 men served in the Seabees during World War II, which is roughly equivalent to the size of the entire present-day Navy. When these men came home, they brought their new and refined skills with them. So for one example, I looked at oral history interviews with former, veterans of World War II. There was a man named Oscar Williams who joined the 133rd Battalion right out of high school and learned to be a construction equipment operator there. And he later recounted in that interview, after returning home to Michigan, quote, "I went back to being an operator. I've got 43 years in as a union operator, 2.5 in the Navy, and I don't regret a day of it." And Oscar Williams was one of many relatively unknown construction men who helped remake the wartime and post-war landscape, right? Who were trained during the war and then applied those skills for post-war career. A more famous individual, and probably someone who came up in the prior lecture with Professor Jackson, was Bill Levitt, who recalled nights spent talking with his fellow Seabees on the battlefront about how to complete the vast projects going on around them better and faster. This wartime experience, he later concluded, offered an unparalleled laboratory for experimentation and analysis with construction industry peers. And after the conflict ended, Levitt put his experience to use, clearing over 1,000 acres of potato fields for the construction of Levittown, Long Island, and other Levittowns besides that. A third example, a firm run by another former Seabee performed clearance work for nearly every interstate in Southern California, while still other Army engineers founded a wrecking and construction company that completed urban renewal building demolition in New Haven, Connecticut. So everywhere I turned in my research, I uncovered Seabees and engineers who were behind a lot of this post-war work. There are many other such stories about how wartime equipment experience translated into post-war employment back home. Now, the rise of post-war equipment operator schools helped to supplement the skilled workforce that these projects required. So some men were trained during the war, others were trained afterwards in these newly formed schools. One such facility was the National School of Heavy Earthmoving Operation, established in 1955 in North Carolina. There, on the school's 71 acres of hilly soil, classes of about 30 students each spent 4 to 8 weeks in a boot camp type environment, learning the art of cut and fill. Most classes at Bulldozer U, as one journalist called this institution, filled to capacity, sometimes months in advance. And over time, similar programs emerged around the country, such as at the Greer Earthmoving School, which is the one that's pictured here on this image. So war set in motion a mobilization of heavy equipment operator training that only continued after the foreign conflict was through. Of course, racial minorities, to say nothing of women, rarely partook of the employment opportunities offered by post-war construction work. And this was a continuation as well of wartime labor practices in the military. For example, African Americans serving in the Army Engineers during World War II typically performed manual work with picks and shovels, while white men more often trained in heavy equipment operation. After the war, contractors and trade unions continued to segregate skilled positions. Minorities received a disproportionately low share of ensuing construction employment, and the positions they did obtain were typically among the lowest paying, non-unionized manual labor jobs, such as those you can see depicted in the image on the left. It was not until Richard Nixon's 1969 Philadelphia Plan for Affirmative Action that these practices really began to change and these labor opportunities expanded more widely. Indeed, by 1973, when an earthmoving training program started in Alabama that was targeted to rural Blacks, the program was unusual enough to merit this profile in Ebony magazine, right? That's 1973. Now, war not only advanced equipment and trained laborers, but it also effectively rehearsed and normalized the practices of material and social clearance. As Seabees and engineers implemented clearance upon foreign terrain, they turned battlefields into proving grounds for home front construction sites. So on the Atlantic front, for example, they cleared rubble-strewn cities in Europe and crushed any built impediments to forward advancement. Depictions of this work often equated the associated demolition and rubble removal with cleaning and rebirth, right? A reframing of what was going on there. And you can see that in the ad here, friend of the cleaner-uppers, right? Planners and architects identified in this destruction opportunities for bigger and better new plans that would build, quote, order out of chaos, as one observer wrote, and to clear the way for progress. And we can see these activities and outlooks mirrored in the post-war American landscape as clearance for urban renewal and highways proactively cut out the purportedly diseased cores of American cities to remake them anew. One observer even described the urban renewal process as, quote, armies of bulldozers smashing down acres of slums. The impact, of course, was devastating. Now I'm going to show a very short clip, just under 2 minutes, excerpted from a Chamber of Commerce video created in 1956 to give you a sense for the ethos of the era and how cities were talking about the need to tear down in order to build up.
The contrast of 1880 and the present is becoming a common sight. The problems of our cities are real, however, because of the heavy hand of old-fashioned design. It affects residential property. Much of our industrial space presents a special problem with old multi-story buildings. The elaborate pigeon roost we see here suggests that obsolescence stalks our apartment properties. Substantial and ornate buildings are to be found everywhere. Surely obsolescence should not cause despair. It is one of the results of America's rapid growth. It is the basic challenge to cities, however, and a twofold problem: architectural obsolescence and narrow lot pattern. The truly dynamic American cities are those that are coming to grips with the problem of outmoded structures. Increasingly, we are seeing large-scale demolition as the first step in building modern cities. The need of the hour is to acquire plottage by merging narrow lots for a new start. Getting needed space in our cities for modern structures is the only way to meet the competitive force of growing suburban strength. Some of our demolition is an easy process because of much light wood construction. Often the substance of our urban structures is such as to resist the power of the demolition hammer. As a people, however, we are steadfast as we tackle problems, and the hammer of demolition will be sure to swing with determination. In this jet age, events move fast, faster indeed than we sometimes realize, and our progress is certain to be steady as we clear away the structures that block progress.
All right. I think they can't hit that building enough times, right, with that wrecking ball. In places like New Haven, Connecticut, which I highlight in part because New Haven happened to save an abundance of its demolition records, which are atypically found. So it's a good place for me to do research about this, but also because New Haven was a place that really dug into clearance in a big way. It secured more federal urban renewal dollars per capita than any other city in the country. And there, 1 out of every 6 dwelling units fell during the 1960s. I gave you that 1 out of 17. Average across the country is 1 out of every 6 was demolished. In the case of New Haven, strikingly reveals post-war depictions of urban renewal clearance as modern and synonymous with cleaning. The city's mayor, Dick Lee, shown here, was so eager to showcase demolition that he was accused of purposefully leaving vacant buildings standing but untouched, so that he'd have sites ready and available for demolition performances whenever a visiting notable or journalist came to town. And indeed, that is what happened in the scene here in early 1958 when he welcomed a Life magazine crew, who in their photo essay about him called him the city cleanup champion. This image clearly indicates Lee's joyful participation in and hands-on endorsement of this work. Another shows his celebration of the snow-covered blank slate that resulted once clearance on one particular parcel was through. And note how, where Lee situates himself in this image. Interestingly, if he's blocking anything, he's blocking the building that's going up. What he wants us to see and appreciate, I think, really is the cleared landscape itself as an example of progress. of course, the work of urban renewal building demolition was nowhere near as simple as Lee and others made it look in photographs like those. And I'll use some other images from various cities to illustrate this point. Demolition produced massive amounts of rubble, which was difficult and costly to dispose of. Some developers unscrupulously buried materials on site. They couldn't figure out where to deposit it, so they just buried it. And it was only uncovered later with the subsequent sinking of a rebuilt property. Other pieces of debris littered cleared lots for years, as it often took much longer to rebuild than to tear down, thereby imposing a different kind of blight on renewal neighborhoods. And although whole blocks were envisioned to come down en masse, difficult relocations and legal opposition led structures to come down in a more patchwork pattern, as shown as this photo. This slowed the process and dramatically increased the price of the work as contractors had to switch to smaller, less efficient equipment. And it even bankrupted some companies in the process. And in this image, this entire block comes down over the course of 10 years, but it takes 10 years for the entirety to happen. And further, for those who had to live alongside demolished structures, the pounding of wrecking balls, damaged chimneys and party walls, and conscribed neighboring residents to live in, quote, the fear and dust of demolition, as one complainant put it in her letter to the mayor. And this is to say nothing, at least yet, of the social hardships of those who were displaced entirely. Yet all these practices of demolition, clearance, and social relocation had been rehearsed and sometimes even celebrated during the preceding experience of war. Equally striking parallels exist between wartime land clearance and the reshaping of post-war suburban terrain, and I'm going to elaborate a bit more here. In the Pacific, Seabees cut into mountains of coral and earth, as you see here, to build flat oil tank pads. They also leveled jungles and coconut tree and sugarcane fields to make way for roadway, airfield, and military base construction. And this is an image from a battalion logbook that pits road building Seabees and bulldozers as engaged in a battle against the jungle. During the war then, nature became just another enemy to be conquered. And that's a kind of mindset that carries over after the war. Similar practices realized on post-war American orchards and hillsides made room for homefront suburban and highway development. The transformation of Southern California really epitomizes this process. Orange County was the fastest growing large post-war county in the country, but vast clearance underpinned this growth, reducing orange orchard acreage by half during each of the 1950s and 60s. And today, less than 67 acres remain from the nearly 67,000 acre peak in 1945. So here's the before and after suburban image pairing, if you will. And how did we get here? Well, statewide during the 1960s, bulldozers reportedly felled one orange tree every 55 seconds. Afterwards, contractors burned the refuse on site, and Orange County was issuing an average of 500 burning permits per month by the mid-1960s before the practice was banned. The whole process then of tree uprooting, refuse removal, and topsoil redistribution cost only about $1 per tree, or roughly $100 an acre, making the destruction of orchards an economical step in the home building process. But as the supply of affordable orchard flatlands dwindled, developers turned to hillsides for additional building sites. This property was available in part because it hadn't made any sense to develop it before. It hadn't been practical, it hadn't been economical. But now, thanks to advances in earth-moving equipment and methods, the increased use of engineers and geologists as consultants on home building sites, the spread of best practices and manuals published by the National Association of Home Builders, it was no longer the case. It did make business sense to develop here. And as the National Association of Home Builders declared in 1969, quote, "There is hardly a site that cannot be developed to serve man." Now, although hillside leveling began with the clearance of trees and shrubs, cut and fill was where the real earth moving occurred. A combination of bulldozers and scrapers dug into steep hillsides and moved the excavated material to below grade areas. Earth movers on one typical project in Anaheim Hills, California, moved enough dirt to cover an entire football field more than 2 stories high each day. Right? That's the scale of what was happening here. The contractor on this particular job began his work with a D7 track-mounted bulldozer, which was one of the workhorses of the World War II military. Heavy scrapers then transported the excavated material while simultaneously beginning the compaction process. And sheep's foot rollers, which is what that instrument is on the far bottom right there, finished the task. Finally, bulldozers redistributed the topsoil, and fast-growing rye helped to cohere the soil. The result of all this was the creation of step terraces that supported the flat building pads necessary for large-scale mass-produced housing. Here then is the blank slate writ large. But such intensive intrusions into the landscape came at a cost. Returning to the war for a moment, Seabees on one island experienced 19 landslides in just one day as they excavated earth to build a jungle roadway. More commonly, though, the consequences of their work took the form of what scholars have called slow violence that only revealed its social and environmental costs over time. For example, clearance for roads and airfields brought not only immediate destruction, but also often permanently diminished some of the island's most fertile ground. And native populations lost their homes and livelihoods for standing in the Allied bulldozers' way. In Hawaii, for example, the Navy crushed sugarcane and pineapple plants to plow roadways down the hillsides. While they didn't own these properties, that posed no practical problem. As one observer noted, quote, "The pineapple people had no choice. Eventually you must sell at the Navy price." Claiming and clearing property proved even easier in the South Pacific, where native homes were often of simpler construction and colonial powers could deprive locals of property rights to their land. One battalion logbook included this picture that you see here of a CB demolishing an islander's home. The caption labels it, quote, "destruction for construction." And we could see similar parallels in the legacies of post-war domestic construction projects. Aggressive hillside development often yielded erosion and culminated, sometimes years later, in landslides of their own. Here you see one such landslide on the slopes of a Southern California suburban home project. Ironically, though, the bulldozer is one of the machines that's often called in to clean up the mess and clear the debris that its earlier application has helped to have wrought. So bulldozers beget bulldozers in a vicious cycle, really. But the social trauma of residential displacement has been even more enduring. This is an image from the home of a Latino American family being bulldozed for urban renewal in Chavez Ravine in California. That's the site that would eventually become Dodger Stadium. Across the country, members of racial, ethnic, and sexual minorities bore the disproportionate burden of clearance-based displacement. Now, the following clip is an excerpt from a public hearing that took place in Philadelphia in the early 1960s. I came upon it in the course of my current research, and this is as that city was pursuing urban renewal. And it gives you a sense of some of the social, the emotional, and physical burdens borne by those who happen to live in the way of progress. The particular homeowner who we're going to hear from, Mildred Sobel, owned a row house that was slated to be demolished to make way for a parking area associated with a new historical society, actually. So let's hear what she had to say in trying to make the case to save her family's home from demolition.
Not much as public speaking, gentlemen. I am Mildred Fusco Sobel. I am the parent of four daughters and a son. They say a mother's happiness comes from her children when they are toddlers. Well, I never was that fortunate to have that happiness because I went out to work in a meatpacking house, 18 below. I went with that purpose to help my husband, to lift the burden, to help pay off the mortgage at 412. Well, last year, we finally reached that goal. And then our bridges came tumbling down when all this redevelopment came along. To think that I have to uproot my family, and I heard something about relocation. Someone mentioned a project. Well, I think it's unconstitutional. Maybe that's the wrong word. Well, I think that's the right word for how I feel. To have to put my children in a project, which I heard we would have to go. We had to deprive ourselves and my children of many little luxuries because, as you know, down the waterfront, it's very hard work and you work when the ships come in. And I don't think a tourist with any humane feelings would appreciate a garden or would want to park their car if they knew the knowledge that a family had to be uprooted. I'm very nervous. That's all I can say. That's how I feel. Thank
Mrs.
you very
Sobel,
much.
would you have any objections to remodel your home according to the
No,
authority?
we've been looking forward to all this because, Mr. DiOrtona, when we moved in this home, the floors were termiting from the joist. And we had a coal stove for almost 2 years till we were able to put oil heat in. That was the reason I went to work. And it took all these years to do it. When we finally reached the goal, when we paid off the mortgage about 6 months ago.
But you would be
Naturally,
willing to
we would.
conform
I'd
to the
even go
authority.
back to work for it.
You would go back to
Yes,
work
sir.
for it just to live there.
I'm in the local 195 for 19 years.
Right, so the majority of displaced residents in Mildred Sobel's neighborhood were ethnic whites, like the Polish-speaking neighbor whose testimony followed her in that public hearing. These ethnic minority residents of Eastern European descent were not uncommon targets of urban renewal, but nationally, 60% of residents relocated by urban renewal were non-white, and highway clearance functioned similarly. Relocation also proved challenging as federal assistance was inconsistently available depending on why and where one was displaced for urban renewal or a highway. In this photo, you can see one relocation agent speaking with residents who would be displaced by urban renewal in Washington, D.C.'s Southwest neighborhood. Across the country, 90% of the housing destroyed was never replaced. And due in part to real estate market segregation, African Americans purchased only 2 to 3% of the new owner-occupied housing units that were constructed in the suburbs, essentially imposing a double blow. Relocation also wrought harsh emotional impacts. Follow-up studies found that physically improved housing never made up for the psychosocial losses of communities that were torn apart. As one displaced resident in New Haven recalled, quote, "It was very traumatic for all of us, a way of life went." And so visual culture from the war and the early post-war period, though, positioned the work, the machines, and the practitioners of clearance in a positive all-American light that helped to facilitate their popular embrace. For example, wartime advertisements suggested that exerting the bulldozer's pressure on the earth was akin to bulldozing over the leaders of Axis powers. Wartime journalism even made these allusions more literal, popularizing stories of operators who used their bulldozers to both level the land and battle the enemy. In one notable incident, which is depicted in this cartoon on the right, a military equipment operator deployed his blade to crush a bunker filled with Japanese snipers. Oft-repeated tales like this one helped make construction operators and their machines patriotic heroes. Wartime films offered further drama. In the climactic scene of the Fighting Seabees from 1944, Seabee John Wayne valiantly rides his bulldozer into battle, and although Wayne dies in the incident, the bulldozer carries on without him, crashing into an oil tank to create an explosion that sends the attacking Japanese enemy fleeing. I want to take a quick look, just 1 minute of this film, look at a scene near the film's end, which celebrates both the construction men and their machines.
What are you shooting for? I was afraid the fall might kill him.
All right, that sound was a little off for me. I hope it was audible there, but mainly you saw the visuals of how the machine itself was being, and the operators were really the heroes of this story. And representations such as these helped to turn the bulldozer operator into an updated version of the American cowboy, really. The bulldozer man, as we may call him, was strong, handsome, white, and rode a mighty beast, the bulldozer itself, to conquer new frontiers. This image here is a near full-page photograph of one CV who appeared in Life magazine at the end of the war, and it perhaps visualizes this concept best. These associations continued into the post-war period as the bulldozer man moved on to conquer so-called urban slums and as yet undeveloped suburban landscapes. In the process, the labor of the bulldozer operator deploying powerful American-made technology offered a patriotic antidote to collective Cold War anxieties over masculinity. And as one advertisement enthusiastically predicted near the war's end, quote, "Mother Earth is going to have her face lifted. Sounds like a rather ambitious undertaking, doesn't it? But that's more or less what's going to happen after this world struggle is over. The Earth is in for a tremendous resurfacing operation. The construction, road building, and grading jobs for crawler-type tractors in that not too distant period are colossal." Now, of course, you'll note that Mother Earth has a somewhat forlorn expression as our cowboy plows across her surface, perhaps in prophetic anticipation of the resistance that's still ahead. And we'll get there. But post-war writing also depicted construction men with childlike admiration. One operator who was quoted in a 1954 article described the, quote, fun of operating a shovel. Speaking gleefully of the work of his mechanical cats, he boasted, "The big machine gave me a sense of power. I, a man of average size, could walk up to a mountain and move it." At the same time, a new genre of children's bulldozer books also helped to naturalize clearance by celebrating happy, helpful bulldozer operators and their friendly mechanical mates. You might think here of books like Katie and the Big Snow, which is on the left, I Want to Be a Road Builder in the middle, and one of my favorite titles, The Affable, Amiable Bulldozer Man, who looks very satisfied with himself after he toppled this 1880 building. Other titles, including Virginia Lee Burton's Mike Mulligan and his Steam Shovel from 1939, and Clement Hurd's Benny the Bulldozer from 1947 add to this list. Books like these normalize construction equipment and processes, and while also making the equipment itself seem less scary. Construction equipment toys took this process even further. The Tonka trucks and model toys, which also first started appearing in the early post-war years, paired with bulldozer books to help youngsters make sense of the rapidly changing world around them. Yet they did so in a way that positively reflected the interests of the equipment makers and contractors who sometimes supported the publication of these books and the production of these toys. And so, building upon the strong foundation established by World War II and then carried over into the post-war period through more powerful technology, plentiful skilled laborers, advanced clearance practices, and positive popular representations, the culture of clearance ran rampant across the landscape. As the pace of destruction reached its peak during the 1960s, its harmful consequences were becoming increasingly clear. The purportedly clean blank slates that clearance sought to achieve proved anything but simple in practice. In Southern California, boosterish bulldozing for new crops of housing depleted farmland, instigated landslides, and furthered sprawl. At the same time, in New Haven, Connecticut, initially triumphal performances of clearance gave way to decades of dirty and damaging neighborhood invasion that ruptured communities and often yielded rubble-strewn vacant lots turned parking lots at best. And the interstate highway network, spreading across the country, sliced through cities and natural landscapes, dividing communities in its path. Overall, clearance of the natural and built environment all too often proved physically difficult, socially traumatic, and environmentally damaging. And so by the late 1960s and 70s, where I end my story, mounting criticism was developing. Seminal written works by Jane Jacobs and In the Environmental Spirit of Rachel Carson embodied this growing critique. But dissent also abounded in other media. For example, the bulldozer became a veritable paintbrush, appearing in new forms of conceptual art like earthworks and architecture. Artist Michael Heiser appropriately donned a cowboy hat as he transported the machine to the desert to dig massive excavations that essentially stopped time, preserving the cuts and voids for all to see, instead of covering them over, as typically happens on the construction site. Similarly, Robert Smithson used a backhoe to pile dirt atop a wooden shed at Kent State, only stopping once the building's roof broke. And Walter Di Maria was even more explicit when he painted a 7 by 20 foot canvas in, quote, caterpillar yellow paint and affixed a plate in the middle that read, the color men choose when they attack the earth. Artists like these offered subtle critique, reappropriated heavy equipment and wrecking sites, and even at times advanced social and environmental reclamation. Counter-narratives also increasingly appeared in more popular media. Instead of the children's book, Tear Down to Build Up from 1960, we now have this dream sequence in the book My House is Your House from 1970, in which the protagonist is chased by a bulldozer that will soon wreck her New York City apartment building. In the 1973 film Soylent Green, trucks mounted with bulldozer-like shovels do the work of rounding up people to serve as the ingredients for the film's mysterious foodstuffs. And more graphically, in 1974, the comic book The Thing Called Killdozer depicted a possessed and fanged bulldozer about to eat multiple human targets. That bulldozer, it's alive, laments the male hero, and it's trying to destroy us. These fictive depictions, while graphic and at times humorous, reflected changing attitudes towards the machine as broader social, political, and economic life was changing as well. Riots and arson wrought uncontrolled devastation in American cities, while sprawl spread rapidly outside them. Foreign manufacturers like Komatsu began to usurp American dominance of the equipment trade, and construction hard hats lent their support to very different and more controversial kind of war on people and land in Vietnam. Within this altered context, and in light of experiences gained on post-war clearance sites, Americans in this later time period were more often found battling against rather than with the once celebrated machine. Their protests helped spur legislative changes like the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the National Environmental Protection Act of 1970. And whereas the post-war period had seen the introduction of substantial federal subsidies for highway construction and slum clearance, as well as tax incentives for suburban greenfield development, national policies introduced during the 1960s and 70s supported preservation, environmentalism, and increased citizen participation in the planning and use of space. So although building demolition and land clearance continue today, their character, pace, and scale have been changed, I think, by the processes and consequences revealed on the once welcoming landscapes of their widespread post-war implementation. Ultimately, the reforms that those experiences spurred have helped to slow, although of course not to stop, the destructive progress of the American bulldozer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. That was fascinating, and certainly fits in with this study of how suburbs came to be and how our landscape came to be so different than it had been historically. And as a historical society and an owner of historic properties, I think it also hits our hearts. We think about interest in preserving the new and repurposing it when it's possible. But as you'll see in our later lectures, we also talk about how suburbs do need to change. So there's a constant pull and push here. So we're going to get into some questions and answers, and we welcome both those in the audience here at the museum. I'll bring a microphone around, and also those on Zoom to enter their questions. And we'll start with a question in the room. Who wants to be first? So, some comment, question, thought that you'd like to share? Or we could start with one from Zoom. Ruth?
We do. Can you hear me? Okay, we do have a question. Did the creative destruction period you so thoroughly described result in nationwide acknowledgement of the need for historical preservation? Massachusetts established its statewide historical commission, which then formalized local commissions in 1963. Do we have the bulldozer to thank for this?
Thanks for that question. Well, I don't think we even today have nationwide acknowledgement of the need for historic preservation, but certainly the growth in appreciation for it is related to this period of dramatic devastation. It is no accident that Massachusetts, that other states, that the country follows up with historic preservation legislation shortly after. And I think because urban renewal and suburbanization really did happen everywhere in a really widespread way, we can identify places that did this sort of thing in a big way in earlier time periods, but it was a national phenomenon, and that really brought it to the fore, I think. And the other related piece is that other piece of legislation I mentioned, which is the National Environmental Protection Act of 1970, or NEPA, which was really a critical ingredient in requiring environmental evaluations, environmental impact statement creation to say, okay, if you're going to propose a federal project or anything using federal dollars, what are the impacts going to be, and what would be the plan for mitigating those? And it was that legislation actually that was widely utilized to stop highways in a lot of cases too. So both of those things had a really protective dimension to them, and were direct outgrowths, I think, of the widespread application of clearance by bulldozers and other means.
On the conservation point, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the other microphone. On the conservation point, here in Hingham, not only did the Hingham Conservation Commission become part of town government when there was concern about Route 93 coming, and the expectation was that a lot of large properties would be broken up for development, and there was concern about what that would do to the environment. So the Conservation Commission became part of town government, and the Hingham Land Conservation Trust was formed to try and acquire some of these properties, which they did acquire some properties for open space. And so we've done a relatively good job in Hingham, although we have thanks to the post-war results of the Navy munitions depots on the back river, and what's now Wampatuck Park becoming in one case a local park, in one case a state park. So we have a lot of land here that is now open space, but the Conservation Commission continues to do its job in terms of wetland protection, for example, there's growing grassroots interest in protecting our trees again. If people are taking trees down, what are they doing to put larger trees back? So this is an evolving process, even as we realize the need for different types of housing in our suburbs. More questions from the room?
I have one. What about policies with regard to private property?
So eminent domain was a big piece of making possible a lot of the claiming of land during this period. And you had, particularly urban renewal really brought this to the fore. So a seminal case of eminent domain case law was Berman versus Parker, which was an urban renewal related project which is a case that grew out of an urban renewal project in Washington, D.C., where it was an owner of a commercial site who said, "There's nothing wrong, with my property. It's not dilapidated, but you're taking it for an urban renewal project." And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they determined that that was a valid public use. So property rights really were limited a lot during this period. This is how it happened, that eminent domain was conceived in a very broad way and led to the takings for highways. I think were probably a bit more straightforward because it was a public use, even if people didn't like to lose their land for that and their home for that. But to take someone's home so someone else could have a home there was really kind of shocking, I think, for a lot of people. And the case law from the time supported this. So the redevelopment authorities that were able to acquire and clear land were able to do that because of the way that eminent domain was applied.
Another thing that happened here in Hingham was zoning. So when Bradley Woods was being developed for the purpose of housing people associated with the shipyard, The town felt it was, really the patriotic duty to make sure that there was housing for the shipyard workers and Navy, Marines, various people who would be involved with the shipyard. But they realized that there was more to come in development. And so at the same town meeting, I think it was, where they approved Bradley Woods development, they also, for the first time, approved having zoning implemented for Hingham. Before that, people could build just, they owned the property, they could just put something up, commercial building, retail, home, depending on what they wanted to do. And then zoning changed that. So a lot of different things that came out right around, leading out of the war, people reacting to what was happening in terms of development. Other comments or questions?
Yeah, I grew up in St. Louis, and in the 50s and 60s, there was just an amazing case of slum clearance all through the western side of St. Louis, outside of the main city area. I mean, a lot of what you were talking about was about the urban area, but these were slums all on the outside of St. Louis that were turned into suburbs just at an amazing rate. I mean, you obviously touched on that, but I'm just wondering, were there a number of cities like that you use as examples in the book, where the entire landscape of housing was changed?
Not featured so much in the book, but absolutely, there were diverse places and ways in which this was applied. There's been some really wonderful work done documenting kind of the scale of urban renewal, and it's not just in cities; it's in suburban areas. It's in Puerto Rico. It's everywhere in the country, actually, and that's what really made this period so significant, I think. It's why it captured my attention. I teach the history of urban planning, and there have been a lot of big ideas in urban planning throughout time. Relatively few of them have been applied in widespread ways, right? But this one really sailed and really flew. And, I'm trying to wrap my head around why, something that seems so destructive that we look at today. And that did improve some, physical dilapidation in cities for sure, but that also brought a lot of damage. How is it that people got behind that? And it's really this combination of the need for better housing and people thinking that everyone would benefit from that better housing, which didn't necessarily happen, that everyone would benefit equally. And then also, competing with the suburbs too, right? And that great fear that everything was going to be lost. So that suburban growth, the taxes, the residents, all of that. And so what happened in cities was directly related to what happened in the suburbs. And you're right, suburbs resulted in some ways from this too. So there's so much more to be said about urban renewal. And I'm delighted to see there's a lot of scholarship about it. But you're right, it's not just a lot of the first projects were those classic downtown. Someone mentioned the West End in Boston in the chat too. These were where things started, but very quickly it moved to other areas. And as planners also sought areas where they could exert their influence too, whereas the resistance was going to be lighter for whatever reason too. So thank you for sharing that other example about how these things are directly connected.
I believe in some cases, Dorchester, for example, which became part of Boston, but was first a suburb, was a streetcar suburb. And you had a lot of triple deckers, and at a certain point they were outlawed, and the reason given was fire hazard. There were they now had zoning that said you could only have so many kitchens, above the first floor. I think they didn't allow kitchens, or above the second floor. So what are really some beautiful triple deckers survive, but there was a lot of movement against that type of construction that was now seen as old-fashioned and perhaps dangerous. Instead of trying to improve it, it was outlawed. Other comments or questions in the room? Ruth.
3 more.
Great.
How have moral and policy considerations been focused on the building and use of bulldozers? And as an aside, the author of this question says, I was raised in Peoria, Illinois, home of Cat, where both my father and grandfather worked there for most of their lives. And this person is also an urban planner.
Well, thanks for that question. I think, you know, the story is really about, I talk about the bulldozer central. It's really about clearance as a mode of building and planning and changing, and even urban renewal itself very quickly started to change after the initial focus on clearance alone. So I didn't talk so much about the policies, but the Housing Act of 1949 was what ushered in urban renewal. And the government said it would pay, federal government would pay 2/3 of the cost of acquiring and clearing land, but you had to clear the land. That was the only thing that you could do to be eligible for the money. And then the cities would have to pay the further 1/3. So there was a huge economic incentive to clear away rather than to do something different. Then the Housing Act of 1954 came along and said, we'll actually fund rehabilitation, not just clearance. So it was possible to do a different kind of urban renewal project. But by that time, so many clearance projects were in the works. And also there was something appealing, right, about starting over, modernizing and making way for the automobile and parking garages and different kinds of more modern cities. One thing that's always struck me as interesting, colleague Stephanie Rybert Webster has written about this. You know, a place like Philadelphia really embraced rehabilitation a lot bigger way than clearance relative to peer cities. And what she found as part of why that was just it was cheaper and more efficient. It wasn't this, you know, of course, Philadelphia has historic resources and some people were motivated by that. But this was just cheaper. You know, you didn't have to rely on a big developer to come in and do a mega project. You have smaller scale things that would happen more quickly and not have those empty parking lots awaiting development for a long period of time. So that wasn't necessarily primarily a moral response at all. It was very much driven by economy and efficiency of how to get the job done. So we do see changes over time. And I think, you know, we think a lot more carefully about clearance as the only way to do things. We incentivize adaptive reuse and other things right today. But I think it's very often been about economy and efficiency, much more than moral directly. One other thing I'll say just about bulldozers and equipment, and I alluded to it at the end, was just that the way that the machines got bigger and in the Vietnam War, for example, and they were still sometimes produced by the same companies, but they were these gargantuan instruments, and actually those became much more morally complicated, just related to that war too. So the machine itself wasn't as simple in how it was being depicted, but there's a lot more going on than just that. It has, as I said, to do with other companies starting to take the lead here, non-American companies, and then this becomes less of an American pride and progress story exclusively too. So a lot of things going on.
Okay, we have another question from our Zoom audience. Do you have any book or video recommendations to help us better understand the impact of the interstate highway or urban belts on the destruction of urban neighborhoods?
Sure. So one that's close to home, I'm looking at the title. Carolyn Crockett is the author who wrote about Boston and the anti-highway movement there. People Before Highways is the name of her book. It came in a few years ago, and so she talks about why the highway was able to be stopped, a part of the highway in Boston, but also about the politics of local government, national government. So that's wonderful. And also the 99% Invisible podcast recently did a session with Carolyn and others related to that anti-highway movement. And it's the first episode, I think, in a 4 or 5 part series about the Big Dig. So that's the kind of precursor story to where we get the Big Dig. So I think that's of local relevance to all of you too. So you can check that out. That's for free. 99% Invisible. It's not a video, it's a podcast. And Carolyn Crockett's book, I say, check that out to learn more about highways. There's lots of people written about this too, but that's a good starting point.
I have 2 questions that kind of go together. The first one, what new bulldozer-like transformative technologies, if any, do you see in the future? And then what thoughts do you have about the future of the bulldozer and human use of it?
Okay. Well, I would like to step back just one tiny bit and make clear that I don't think that the technology alone necessarily is what's responsible here. It's the way in which these technologies have been wheeled in. And I really think federal policy is a big part of the story about the creation of the suburbs and, deductions for mortgage interest, incentivizing greenfield development, such that you can write down new construction more quickly than you could write down something that you're just, keeping longer, that you're rehabilitating, and then also those policies that I talked about with urban renewal. So I think that's a big part of the story as what our policy priorities are and the way that business wields those. But these machines are not inconsequential too, and they symbolize these processes, and they also physically do the work. But I don't just pin it all on the technology by any means. It's the way there's nothing inherently wrong with the bulldozer at all, actually. It's a lot of important things. It's the way in which these ideas are mobilized that I think we need to think critically about. So I want to make that point clear. But then any other bulldozer-like technologies, I think my colleagues, I teach in a planning department, and one of the things that people are very excited about is just the way that electric vehicles and also self-driving vehicles are going to change our landscapes radically. And I think that's one of those things that, how long is it going to take, and how long will we be looking forward to this change, and who knows when it'll actually happen. But self-driving vehicles, I think, could radically transform. If parking is such a key element of the shape of our cities, it could change the way we think about parking and how public space gets allocated to that instead of something different, and the way people move around as well, and thinking about highways and safety and all these things. So I think that's one of those technologies related to self-driving vehicles that's potentially interesting. I don't know if it will live up to all the expectations, but that's something to keep an eye on. And so it'll change things in a different way, and hopefully in a good way, I think, for cities, but we'll see. That was part one. What was the second part of the question? Was there another part, or did I get it?
Bulldozers. That was really the question, and human use.
Could you repeat it again? I'm sorry.
Question. I think you answered the question. It's about the future of bulldozers and what you see in terms of human use. So it was really
okay.
Two of our people asked essentially the same question.
Got it. Yeah. No, I think I'm always when I get to the end of the talk and I talk about how we still bulldoze and that our practices are changed, and sometimes I do wonder how much our practices have changed, and how much we still tear down and displace, and how much the drive to compete with the suburbs and think about the suburbs and cities shapes our landscapes. In Philadelphia, we have a movement right now. There is a set of developers who are interested in building a downtown arena that would dramatically affect, I think, Chinatown in Philadelphia, and directly or indirectly cause a lot of displacement there. And I hear just a lot of echoes of the earlier era of tearing down things that have been there before, building in this kind of savior project, and what's it going to do to people who live there, and also how this relates to getting people in from the suburbs to go to games, who want to go to this downtown location. And in this case, arguing that transportation that's centralized there will help them. But have we changed actually our way of thinking about how to reshape landscapes and how to deal with people socially with those development processes? Sometimes I feel disheartened that we haven't learned that much, but hopefully people pay attention to the history and act and become activists as they have in the past, because it is possible to stop and reshape and change the application of these things. But it takes work and a knowledge of what's worked in the past. So I definitely recommend, again, Carolyn Crockett's book on that front.
Any comments or thoughts in the room before we close? Well, thank you all for your attention. Thank you, Francesca, for the presentation. Fascinating. Some of those videos were really quite stirring.
Thank you.
And I just want those of you who are here in the museum to know that you can get a copy of Bulldozer here at the museum. So join us for our little reception, and we will have copies available for you. I want the audience both online and here to know about our next speaker, and Max mentioned him briefly. James O'Connell will be speaking here at the museum on December 3rd. And this will be a very of local interest. The Hub's Metropolis, Greater Boston's Development from Railroad Suburbs to Smart Growth is his book. And he looks at all the different types of suburbs that there are in the Boston metropolitan area and how they came to be. O'Connell's a planner who also teaches at BU's Metropolitan College. And I want to now thank Colin, the wonderful technical wizard behind these programs. Colin McGinnis, Ruth Gilbert Whitner, who voiced the questions from Zoom. Thank you, Ruth. And other members of our education committee who have been helpful today, Kathy Curley, Judith Brooks, and Jane Shute. Thank you all for your continued work on this series. And I'd now like to invite the museum audience to join us on the second floor for a little light refreshments and conversation. Thank you all. This ends our Zoom.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca.